I came back to my farm expecting to check on the fence line and maybe spend a quiet afternoon with a cup of coffee on the porch. But instead I found cement mixers rumbling on my land and a line of workers spreading wet concrete across the field my grandfather had plowed by hand. The first thing I saw was a woman in oversized sunglasses standing in the middle of it all with a clipboard, shouting directions like she was building a mall. She didn't even flinch when she saw me walking up the driveway. She smirked and said loud enough for her crew to hear, "Perfect timing, farmer boy. You're about to witness real progress. This dusty old patch of yours is officially the new community parking lot." And that was the moment I knew this wasn't going to be a misunderstanding. It was going to be a war. Before I tell you how I ended up buying her entire HOA and demolishing every slab of concrete they poured, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. I stayed calm. Not because I didn't feel the heat boiling in my chest, but because I knew showing anger would give her fuel. She wanted me rattled. She wanted me to yell while her people recorded, and instead I gave her the coldest stare I had. I told her flatly that she was trespassing and that her trucks needed to turn around. She laughed and waved her clipboard like it was some golden permit. "Don't be so dramatic," she said. "You should thank us. Your land finally has a purpose." I looked past her to where the first lines of gray cement were swallowing the black soil, and I could almost see the generations of sweat and calloused hands disappearing under that gloss of wet stone. My grandfather's stories, the long summers the first spent baling hay, the fence posts my father hammered down one by one. All of it was being smothered by a stranger's arrogance. I reminded her in a steady voice that this was private property, deeded and surveyed, but she cut me off. "Not for long," she said. "The county's behind this plan. We're thinking long-term vision. This will increase values for everyone. Don't you want to be part of progress?" That word, progress, was her shield, but to me it was just a way of saying theft with a ribbon on top. Her SUV idled at the edge of the road, polished chrome flashing in the sunlight, looking more out of place than anything I'd ever seen on this soil. The concrete trucks hissed and churned, their drivers pretending not to look at me. In that moment, I knew I needed to ground myself in why I was here in the first place. I hadn't moved back to this farm for attention or arguments. I came back because this land was blood and memory, the only constant in a world that never stopped changing. The fields were where I learned to work before sunrise, the barns where I first drove a tractor, the fences where I leaned against wood rails and listened to my father talk about pride. This wasn't just dirt. It was the backbone of my family, and that was exactly why her arrogance burned so deep. Karen strutted closer, tapping her clipboard against her palm. She told me fines were already stacking up for my so-called obstruction of the community project. She claimed the HOA had authority to enforce compliance even here. I looked at her, letting the silence stretch, then asked, "Did your clipboard tell you that too?" Her face tightened for just a second. Then she smirked again. She was enjoying this, feeding off it, convinced she was untouchable. That wasn't the first I had heard of her little campaign. Weeks earlier, envelopes had started arriving with HOA letterheads telling me I was in violation for things like non-compliant barn paint and unkempt grass along road frontage. I ignored them because my farm wasn't part of their neighborhood covenant and never had been. I figured it was just noise, the same way junk mail shows up in every box. But looking at those trucks pumping concrete onto my land, I realized it hadn't been noise. It had been the warm-up. I pulled out my phone and started filming. She noticed immediately, but instead of shying away, she squared her shoulders and smiled like she was giving a campaign speech. "Film all you want," she said. "This is the future." The workers kept pouring, some of them glancing nervously at me. One muttered under his breath, probably wondering if they were really supposed to be here. I asked her if she'd shown the sheriff her paperwork. She said she didn't need to, that the HOA board had approved everything. "We are the authority here," she declared, as if standing in the middle of someone else's farm gave her a crown. When the sheriff finally arrived after I called, he looked around awkwardly, thumb hooked in his belt. He said it wasn't exactly his jurisdiction, that it was a civil matter between property owners. Karen pounced on that hesitation, wagging her clipboard like it was a badge. "See? Even law enforcement understands progress," she said. I stepped closer to him, keeping my voice low but steady, and asked if he saw the same thing I did. Concrete trucks trespassing on private land. He sighed, admitted it looked wrong, but repeated that without a court order his hands were tied. Karen smiled like a cat that had just cornered a bird. I didn't shout, I didn't argue. Instead, I looked right at her and said, "Strange. I don't recall leasing my property to your vision." That shut her up for half a second, and in that silence, I knew I had struck the first crack in her wall of arrogance. She barked at her workers to keep going, clearly rattled, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She wasn't used to resistance. She was used to neighbors rolling over, afraid of fines or social pressure. But I wasn't a neighbor in her subdivision. I was a landowner with roots deeper than her concrete could ever run. As the sun dropped lower, the wet cement spread wider, the air thick with dust and diesel fumes. I stood there watching, every detail seared into memory. The gray sheen over soil, the clang of tools, the absurdity of someone deciding my legacy was now her parking lot. I could feel the story beginning to write itself, and I knew the hook wasn't just concrete being poured. It was arrogance setting itself up for a fall. She had no idea that by stepping onto my land, she had already given me all the leverage I needed. I drove back up to the farmhouse that evening, phone buzzing with neighbors texting about what they'd seen. Some warned me that fighting the HOA was suicide, that Karen had too many connections. Others quietly encouraged me, saying they hoped someone would finally stand up to her. The county office wasn't going to help. The sheriff was staying on the fence. But none of that mattered, because I already knew the story wouldn't end with them walking all over me. They thought the concrete they poured was permanent. What they didn't know was that I was already planning to turn every inch of it into rubble, and I wasn't going to stop until their entire empire collapsed. The next morning the sun came up on a farm that felt different, like a house with strangers' furniture in the living room, and by the time I finished my coffee I was already watching a new set of stakes popping up where the wheat usually whispered. Survey flags, bright pink, sawing little lines through my memory. They'd sent a crew overnight, ropes and measuring wheels, and someone with a tablet tapping coordinates like they were mapping out a future mall, and the foreman barely acknowledged me when I walked out, pretending he didn't see the family photographs nailed to my barn or the rusted plow my grandfather used to joke with. That's when the letters started making sense. Those neat envelopes with HOA letterheads demanding compliance, fines for non-compliant barn paint, notices about hedgerow setbacks, all the petty legal-sounding scribbles meant to make a person doubt their own maps. I called the county recorder first, thinking it would be obvious that my deed didn't have an asterisk that allowed neighbors with clipboards to rewrite property lines. But the woman I spoke to was curt and polite and then oddly vague, as if someone had whispered in her ear that the paperwork was pending review. I drove into town and stopped at the old feed store because the owner, Sam, has been at that counter since before I was born, and he knows the neighborhood like a Bible. He didn't waste time on small talk. He poured me coffee from an old pot and said, "They've been talking about that lot for months, bragging up, bringing traffic and added value. Karen's been all over it, buying influence like it's seasonal seed. Folks hate to rock the boat, son, but she's been buying votes at board meetings with promises of paving and lights." He spat the last word like it tasted bad and then slid me a scrap of paper with names he'd overheard at lunches. I asked him if anyone had actually seen the HOA file deeds or permits, and he shrugged, slow and small. "They show up with paperwork that smells official," he said. "But the way they get it passed is what scares neighbors. Pressure, promises, and favors." Back at the farmhouse, the surveyors set little flags like tombstones, and a county vehicle idled at the road, engine ticking. I filmed everything because the sheriff's hesitation the day before had made one thing clear. With enough recorded evidence, you could at least force the story into daylight where other people had to take a stand. A neighbor, Pete, came over while I was filming. He's lived 3 farms down and his hands still look like tools. He glanced at the flags and muttered that he'd gotten a notice too. An invitation to an HOA community visioning session where Karen would present benefits. He stammered, embarrassed, telling me his wife feared the fines more than she feared losing acreage. It felt like a small confession, and you could see the worry line his face had become. "They don't scare everyone into silence," he said quietly. "But people don't want the hassle. They pay the fines because they're cheap, or they buy silence with their already stretched dollars. Hearing that made something colder than anger settle in my chest. The realization that this wasn't just about me. It was a machine of little corruptions that ate at neighbors until they looked away. I walked into town and sat in the county clerk's office again. But this time I brought the deed, the old survey from the university, and a GPS printout from the tractor that showed my boundaries based on the original markers. The clerk shuffled papers, eyes flicking to a screen, and finally admitted someone at the planning department had received an expedited permit request with Karen's name attached. Under that name was an investor I'd never heard of, a young man in a suit who apparently saw profit where I saw pasture. I tracked him down at the hardware store and called him out politely, which made him bristle. He spoke in the investor's voice, numbers and future returns, talked about regional development and community demand. When I told him the concrete crews were on my property, he said, "Owners change hands. It's messy, but ultimately beneficial." I said, "Whose benefit are we talking about?" And he didn't answer with a person, only with a ledger. The sheriff came by again mid-afternoon, same hesitant stance, but quieter this time, like a man who'd been asked to weigh two uncomfortable truths. He told me bluntly that until someone filed an injunction or a court showed up to freeze the work, he couldn't arrest anyone for civil trespass. He did, however, lean closer and say, off the record, that if I could prove the survey stakes were placed incorrectly or that permits were falsified, the scale would tip. That was the first time he used the phrase evidence chain, like it was a tool I could pick up, and not the word of a frustrated bystander. When Karen's crew saw him talk to me, they pressed their jaws, shifting wheelbarrows and trying to look busy, like actors waiting for a cue. Karen herself drove by in that shiny SUV and rolled down her window to shout, "We're building for the greater good," which is something entitled people always say when they're taking something not theirs. I filmed her saying it and felt the weight of the camera like a small sword. Over the next 2 days, the pressure tactics escalated. A parking fine, a notice threatening daily penalties for obstruction of community access, and then a tow warning taped to my gate with a fake signature I could trace back to a janitor at the HOA office who swore he'd never signed anything of the sort. The audacity of a forged signature felt like a personal slap, but the uglier truth was that they were testing me, finding out if I'd flinch. Meanwhile, the town gossip mill churned. The local barbers and the diner table where elders played cards began to choose sides in whispers. Some sided with Karen because she'd promised to repave a road near their stores. Others, like the high school mechanic who'd learned his trade from my uncle, came by to offer to check my fence posts or watch the trucks. It became clear the community was a chessboard, and Karen assumed everyone would let her move the pieces. I started meeting with a surveyor I trusted, a meticulous woman who drove a battered pickup and had the patience of someone who'd spent years reconciling maps with wet clay. She walked my boundary lines with a GPS unit, muttering numbers and reminding me to keep everything recorded. Timestamps, photos, witness names. We put trail cameras at key approach points, and I set up a drone on a low hover to catch angles the survey crew couldn't claim ignorance about. I also started compiling the letters and notices I'd received into a simple binder, dates, envelopes, fingerprints of the paper, little details that would matter when someone tried to say the permits were in order. The sheriff nodded when I showed him the binder. He couldn't act yet, but he said he'd keep a closer watch if I kept collecting things that contradicted Karen's story. At night, I'd sit on the porch and listen to the distant hiss of machines and the soft clink of Sam locking up his store and think through options that didn't involve yelling into the sun. There were lawyers, yes, and courts, but those cost money and time. There were also quieter moves, buying the debt of someone who wanted out, learning the intricacies of the HOA charter, the little procedural backdoors where a majority vote could be flipped, and the slow arithmetic of leverage. I didn't reveal any of that to anyone yet because once you speak a plan it loses its teeth. But I promised myself the same thing I promised my grandfather when he left me the keys. I would protect this land not with bravado, but with something more dangerous, patience and preparation. The surveyor's GPS trace and my trail camera footage were the first bricks in that plan, and by the time the sun sank behind the ridge, turning the new flags into little silhouettes, I had a binder in my truck, a drone battery charged, and a resolve that felt like iron. The day Karen decided to celebrate her concrete like it was a harvest, she sent out glossy invites stamped with words like vision and legacy, and a time that conveniently put the ceremony right when the county clerk's doors would be closed and the press could be corralled into a tidy narrative. I watched the RSVP list grow on social media. Neighbors, small-time investors, a local TV crew that smelled a fight, and when I saw the date, I felt something tilt inside me from irritation to a decision. Enough. That morning I watched her convoy roll in like a parade, heavy equipment glittering under the sun, and she stepped out in that same ridiculous hard hat, sunglasses low, clipboard held like a scepter, and she waved to the camera as if she were the mayor of a city she'd never paid a tax in. "This is for the good of the community," she told the microphones, her voice all practiced warmth. "We're creating useful space so families can enjoy the lake without parking hassles." A woman in the front row clapped for her as if she'd invented common courtesy, and the investor in the navy suit smiled like he could already see the zeros on his spreadsheet. I stood in the treeline with my hands shoved into my jacket pockets, the soil beneath my boots still warm from the morning sun, and I let her speak. Let her pretend. Let the cameras roll. Let the crowd cheer itself into believing that taking someone's land was progress. When she finally paused, waiting for applause, I walked out from the shadows and the hush that felt. For a second, like the pause before a heavy machine starts up again. I kept my voice low and steady, because I've learned that calm lands harder than fury. I said, "You're on private property." And she looked at me as if I were a weather nuisance she could ignore. "We have approvals," she said. "This is already in motion." "Approvals you manufactured," I replied. The sheriff hovered at the edge of the crowd, hands in pockets, eyes flicking, the way a man weighs a coin he cannot freely spend. A camera focused on me and an intern in a suit muttered into an earpiece. The local news smelled a showdown and the internet was already primed for a headline. When Karen laughed, it was small and brittle. "You should be grateful," she said, louder now for the cameras. "People like you need to understand how communities grow." I let the laughter die in the air between us and told her exactly what she was. An entitled board president who'd convinced enough people that concrete equals civility. The hush turned into a ripple of whispers and someone in the back shouted, "What's he going to do? Farmers can't buy HOAs?" And that little jab landed in front of people like a dare. The thing about dares is they tell you exactly where someone thinks the line is. I pressed my thumb to the edge of the invitation card I'd kept in my pocket, folded it like a small map, and let my plan breathe in my chest while the crowd clapped for a ribbon that had already been cut in spirit. The turning point had to be public and undeniable. She'd picked my field for spectacle, and in choosing spectacle she'd given me the stage to retake what she'd assumed she could own. After the ceremony, I let them go back to congratulating one another and circled the perimeter with a slow, methodical step, noticing little things the cameras missed. The way a contractor's logbook had sloppy dates, the way a few downstream homeowners had unpaid HOA dues listed on public tax delinquency rolls, the way paperwork sometimes fluttered when you asked the right awkward questions. I'd already started low and quiet, trail cameras in the trees, a drone with a neutral hover pattern, timestamps on every pass, but what I hadn't revealed to anyone was the other half of the plan that no ribbon or microphone could outshine. Leverage. While the cameras collected images of boots on my soil and the men who'd claim ignorance, I sat in the diner with Sam and a man named Luis who used to manage HOA collections until he'd had enough of Karen's politics and taken a job elsewhere. Luis scribbled names and account balances on a napkin, and when I asked if homeowners ever wanted out, if anyone had unpaid assessments they'd rather offload than fight for, his eyes flickered and he said, "All the time. People carry HOA debt like an old hurt. They'd sell it if the price was right." There was a kind of arithmetic to leverage. Small sums bought in the dark of night could, when aggregated, become a majority if you understood where votes lived. In unpaid dues, in neglected shares, in people who'd rather cash out than come back to a town meeting. I started calling quietly, using a voice that sounded like a buyer with simple motives, and one by one I made offers that seemed generous to people who'd been quietly bleeding cash. Buying liens, acquiring unpaid assessments, securing options to purchase controlling votes on the HOA board that most members treated like an afterthought. It's boring work. Tedious phone calls, stamped envelopes, signatures, but leverage is a numbers game and numbers are how you move mountains when the law only moves slowly. At the same time, I built a physical net to catch her lies. Surveyor's notes that matched my grandfather's original markers, drone footage showing the exact GPS coordinates where the concrete met my deed, and audio files of contractors admitting on the record that they'd been told to ignore boundary lines. I hired a land attorney on a retainer that made my bank account wince, But she was the kind of woman who smelled legal loopholes a man could live in for years. She taught me how to file for temporary restraining orders, how to assemble an evidentiary chain so tight a judge would have to look twice. We didn't file anything yet. Filing too early is like playing your trump card before the last round. But we cataloged everything down to the nail fragments and the exact time each truck rolled over my driveway. I told only 2 people about certain moves. The sheriff, off the record, and Pete, the neighbor with the calloused hands, who promised to stand outside the gate if things heated up. Secrecy kept the plan sharp. Once you advertised an intention, people had time to counter it, and Karen, I'd learned, had a talent for mobilizing favors fast. She kept escalating, of course, because entitlement has its own momentum. One morning I found her crew had parked a loader across my access lane and chained it to a bollard with a makeshift sign that read Community Project in Progress, as if a sign could sanctify theft. Her people bristled when I filmed, and one of them muttered, "You don't get it, old man. This is bigger than your pride." I laughed softly to myself and said, "Bigger than my pride, maybe, but not bigger than my patience." That night I added another layer. A reinforced lockbox on the gate that would not kill but would stall. A clear line that would make a court order look urgent rather than optional. I wanted to avoid confrontation that could turn ugly. I wanted instead to make her expose her arrogance in public, so the legal hammer we were building would land with a judge and a microphone present. The first twist, cameras, fortified access, and a slow reveal of evidence, was set. The second twist, the buying of the debt and votes, was quietly collecting signatures and funds in a way that would let me walk into the next public meeting with more than a gripe. I would walk in with control. And as I charged batteries for the drone and slid the latest signed lien into my folder, I thought about the absurdity of a woman who assumed a parking lot could replace a lifetime of work. She'd cast a stone thinking it would sink any resistance, but she'd only made a mark that led back to her.